I never thought the video that ruined my life would get 50 million views. It started as a joke, a stupid prank in the office. But by the next morning my face was everywhere. The office thief, corporate psycho, man caught stealing on camera. The video showed me pocketing money from the charity jar at work. Except, I never did. It was edited. Someone had cut the footage and made it look real. And in the comments, everyone loved to hate me. I lost my job within 24 hours. My girlfriend dumped me. My landlord wanted me out. My parents told me not to come home until I learned to take responsibility. The only problem was, I wasn't guilty. For a week I barely slept. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with hate messages, memes, threats. I couldn't even walk into a store without people whispering. The world had made up its mind. Then, 3 nights later, a message appeared on my screen. You were never supposed to find out who did it. No name. No photo. But I recognized the background in the image attached. The blue-tiled wall of the break room. The same one from work. That's when it hit me. This wasn't random. Someone inside the company set me up. I went to the HR manager, but she wouldn't even let me in the building. My ID card had been deactivated. Security escorted me out like a criminal. So I stood on the street, staring up at the glass tower where I used to work and made myself a promise. If they wanted to ruin my life, I'd burn down theirs, digitally. The first thing I did was change my name. Not legally, just online. I deleted every account, every trace of the man I used to be. Then I created a new profile, a new persona, no signal. For months, I studied everything I could about cybersecurity. Hack forums, data leaks, deep web markets. Anything that could help me find whoever framed me. I wasn't rich, but rage makes you resourceful. By spring, I had access to things I shouldn't. Databases, internal servers, even private company chats. It wasn't long before I found the file, the original video footage from that day. And the timestamp told me everything. The video had been edited by someone logged in under the username T. Grant. Tyler Grant, my former supervisor. The guy who smiled in my face while destroying my career behind my back. But there was something else in those files, something bigger. Hidden folders, financial records, transaction logs. He hadn't just framed me, he'd been stealing from the company for months, funneling money through shell accounts in the Caribbean. Suddenly, I wasn't just the victim anymore. I was holding a live grenade. The question was, how to pull the pin. I couldn't go to the police. No one would believe me after that viral video. But I could do something better. I could expose him the same way he exposed me. So I built a trap. A fake investment pitch using his offshore accounts. I made sure he'd find it. And when he did, I'd catch every move he made. As I stared at his photo, that smug grin, that stupid designer watch, I realized something strange. I wasn't scared anymore. I wasn't angry either. I was calm. Focused. For the first time since the video, I felt alive again. And I knew this was just the beginning. The username blinked into my feed like an invitation. T. Grant had logged into the offshore portal again. I watched the cursor hover over an account. No numbers, just the cold glow of someone who thought himself invisible. He was sloppy in ways that mattered. Confidence leaves trails, arrogance leaves them open. I didn't hack in the cinematic sense. I spent nights becoming boringly good at spotting mistakes. Oversights, reused passwords, people who forwarded sensitive files to their work email because convenience beat caution. I read every thread he posted, every picture he tagged until he became predictable. That predictability was my ally. I built a persona that fit into his world, a private investor named Grant Interest with taste and patience. I filled pages with the right sort of noise, mock background checks, a small web of plausibility, and left breadcrumbs that led directly to the folder I wanted him to touch. I didn't break into anything, I baited him. Predators never pass up a scent of opportunity. When Tyler took the bite, he did it in a way that showed 2 things, greed and fear. He used the same slang in messages that his signature invoices used. He double-clicked files without thinking. I watched the exchange unfold in rushes. A shell company name, a routing number, an email that tied one of his favorite vendors directly to the Caribbean account. It felt obscene, like watching a man sign his own confession with a pen dipped in his arrogance. Now I had 2 choices. I could publish everything anonymously and watch the media devour him. I could leak it in 100 screaming posts and become the noise that had eaten me. Or I could stop him where it would hurt most. His money, his credibility, his network. The smarter the pressure, the less messy the fallout for those around me. So I did all of it in measured strokes. I fed the files to an investigative reporter I'd met through a forum. Someone with a reputation for careful verification. No leaks, No sensational headlines at first, just a quiet conversation over coffee in a cafe that smelled like burnt espresso. She listened, asked exact, slow questions, and then told me she'd run the documents through 3 independent checks before publishing. Her caution was my shield. If there was to be a public reckoning, it would be surgical, not theatrical. At the same time, I made anonymous calls to a regulatory body that had teeth but moved slowly like a glacier. They opened an audit. Not the kind that makes headlines at midnight, the kind that sends letters and freezes accounts. It's the paper trap of bureaucracy. Precise, legal, and maddening to those who thought their spreadsheet could buy them safety. Tyler started to flail. He made moves that were not compromises but desperation. Sudden transfers, frantic explanations to quiet investors, a cheerful public persona that now felt rehearsed. The more he tried to hide, the tighter the legal noose became. The people who had once smiled at his cufflinks began to ask for receipts. But pressure for one person becomes stress for many. I'd thought about collateral, about how my actions would ripple through people's lives. I wasn't naive. I knew vendors would get anxious, employees would fear layoffs, and families would feel the portrait of stability tilt. I tried to aim for the parts of the system that were corrupt, shell companies, forged contracts, phony invoices, so that the cleanup would be structural, not personal. The journalist's first piece dropped like a call to arms. It was not incendiary, it read like a surgeon's report. Senior manager under scrutiny for financial irregularities, it said, and then listed the documents, the transfers, the shipments marked as consulting that led nowhere. Tyler's name was there, understated but damning. The paper's editor followed up with a background piece about corporate culture and how reputations are engineered. People who once retweeted his smiling face started to untag him. My phone became a static-driven chorus. Tips, confirmations, threats, both thin and ugly, poured in. Someone left a voicemail that suggested I should just drop it if I wanted to keep my apartment. My hands shook once when I heard it, more from the memory of the viral video than from fear. The lesson from that voicemail was clear. Power fights back with reach. I responded not with violence but with more structure. I handed a forensic accountant a folder thick with evidence and asked him to write a report that could stand in court. He worked like an artist of numbers, turning transactions into sentences that said, "This was not a mistake. It was a pattern. It was intent." Then I made a move that felt crueler than anything I'd done so far. I contacted people I knew at Tyler's firm, juniors who'd been overlooked, an assistant who'd once told me she admired my work ethic. I offered them anonymity, legal protection, and a simple thing I'd wanted when my life fell apart. The truth unspooled in a way that mattered. One by one, they told me things that were small and perfect in their clarity. An off-the-books meeting, a contract signed subject to retrospective approval, a vendor who'd been promised bonuses for expediting. Their testimonies, combined with the documents, shifted the story from scandal to systemic fraud. Investors who'd thought of Tyler as a rising star realized they were backing someone who'd been wiring money out of the company they were supposed to grow. The hedge funds called for emergency audits. The board forced his leave pending investigation. Publicly, Tyler tried to solder himself back together with denials and the same old smile. Privately, he made mistakes worse by micromanaging damage control. A frantic email he sent to a client, meant to be confidential, was forwarded by mistake to a journalist. It was a line in that email that changed everything. Handle the little problem. We cannot afford a scandal now. In context, it was damning. In context, it read like a confession. And still, the final step required a choice I didn't relish. Names would be named. Companies would be listed. People would face consequences. Maybe some of them were the kind of people who deserved it. Maybe others were cogs who'd been told not to look too closely. I thought of my ex-girlfriend and how quick she'd been to let me be a monster without asking why. I thought of my landlord who'd kicked me out without a second thought. Would exposing Tyler fix those things? No. But exposure would at least keep him from repeating the damage. When the SEC opened a formal inquiry and an independent counsel was appointed, the company's stocks dropped. The board convened in emergency sessions and contacted counsel. Tyler, who'd once been untouchable, began to look small in photographs, head lowered, tie askew. The same feeds that had fed my ruin now narrated his unraveling. There was a cold symmetry to it that I could not unsee. The machinery that had made me a villain was now turning its teeth on its own. At night I walked the city with a small, steady rage that had softened into a purpose. I thought often of the video that started it all, how simple edits could consign a man to ruin. I thought of the people who'd clicked and judged and moved on. I thought of how fragile reputations were and how easy it was to weaponize that fragility. I'd started out wanting to clear my name. Somewhere along the way I'd become an instrument of correction. But there were moments, quiet ones, where the victory tasted thin. An assistant who'd helped me told me she'd been suspended pending an internal review. A vendor had lost a contract when the company froze operations. The ledger had been balanced, but in doing so, we had rearranged people's lives. My hands bore the same stains as the men I'd targeted, only painted in paper instead of blood. The revelation finally came like the slow crack of ice. Tyler was arrested at his country club for contempt related to the inquiry. The press flocked, cameras hungry for angles and rehearsed outrage. I watched the footage from a bench in the park where, months before, I'd once eaten a sandwich with a happy face. The man on the screen was not the monster I'd imagined. He was a frightened, ordinary man who had done monstrous, ordinary things. When the arrest happened, I expected fireworks inside me. I expected to feel cleansed, righteous, vindicated. Instead, I felt the quiet hollow that follows a long effort, accomplishment without the catharsis of revenge's fantasy. The world did what it does. It found a new story by the next morning. People moved on. I realized then the odd truth. My war had never been with Tyler alone. It had been with a system that rewarded spectacle and silenced small voices. Toppling him mattered both because he was guilty and because his fall was an object lesson. If one man could be taken down, maybe the next would think twice. The headline read, "Senior Manager Arrested, Company Under Investigation." I clicked away not because I had grown tired of it but because I needed to breathe. The campaign had drained me and, in small ways, taught me how to rebuild patience. No signal, I thought as I powered down my burner laptop. No noise. For once enough. The arrests were the easy part. The paperwork that followed, the subpoenas, depositions, and endless evenings under fluorescent lights, were the parts that dug into your bones. Tyler's jail booking made the morning news, but the real work lived in conference rooms and evidence lockers, where truth was a slow, mechanical thing rather than a headline. When the initial fury faded, two truths settled over my life like dust. First, destroying a lie doesn't fix every broken thing it touched. Second, even the clean victory of proof leaves residue. People I'd spoken to, coaxed into testimony, had to deal with their own professional fallout. Vendors were cautious again. Some co-workers who'd helped me quietly were quietly punished for breaking ranks. I slept less well not because I worried about being found out, but because I felt the weight of what we'd set in motion. My name was cleared publicly, one small paragraph on page 3 of an apology piece, but clearing a name and reclaiming trust are different jobs. The company reinstated a few policies, the board announced structural changes, and one of Tyler's partners resigned. The investor withdrew some capital, then replaced it with oversight committees and audits. That was the bureaucratic part of repair. Visible, measurable, often boring. Mattered. It also didn't bring my old life back. People ask if I felt triumphant when the court read the verdict. The honest answer, no. There was no glowing sense of triumph, just a quiet release, like someone unclenching a jaw they didn't know they'd kept tight for a year. The rush of vindication lasted as long as it takes to empty a glass. Then the room filled with ordinary things. A landlord asking for the rent he'd deferred, emails from recruiters with cautious tones, a voicemail from my sister asking how I was sleeping. I tried to rebuild slowly. The first thing I did was get a small place with a back porch and grow herbs in pots. There was something about the tactile, quiet business of watering that soothed me. I took classes, data ethics, information security, not because I wanted to be a crusader but because I had learned that competence is a kind of armor. I helped a friend set up a nonprofit that advised people wronged online, offering pro bono counsel and a resource hub. It was small-scale redemption, practical and dull and honest. Relationships were the tricky ones. My ex-girlfriend called once, polite and distant, asking if I was doing better. There was no anger in my voice when I said yes. The rage that had kept me alive through months of sleepless nights had burned down to embers. It had fulfilled me enough to do the right thing, and left me wanting the simpler goods. A dinner without checking a burner laptop, a walk without running scenarios in my head. Not everyone forgave me for what I'd done. Some people said I'd become the kind of person I hated, adept at manipulation, willing to weaponize truth. They weren't totally wrong. I'd used the same tools the smear machine used, but aimed at a different target. There was a grotesque symmetry to that. The measure, I told myself, was outcomes. The consultant lost accreditation, the shell companies were dissolved, and a handful of innocent vendors were made whole by settlements. The ledger had been balanced in practical terms, even if the calculus felt ugly at times. One afternoon, months after the dust settled, Tyler's old assistant ran into me at a coffee shop. She looked smaller than in memory, hair shorter, eyes alert in a new way. She slid into the seat across from me and said quietly, "Thank you for making them stop." Her voice was low, without ceremony. For a moment I let myself take the gratitude like a bomb. It didn't erase what had been lost, but it reminded me that some things mattered. People who could sleep without a late-night panicked call, families not uprooted by a scandal spread for clicks. The nonprofit grew, modest but real. We counseled a teacher who'd been smeared by a classroom prank that spun online, a contractor whose name had been entangled with a construction fraud he hadn't known about, a Paralympian whose reputation had been cheapened by a doctored clip. Each case reminded me of the fragile geometry of reputation and the disproportionate harm of enforced rumor. We couldn't fix every wrong. We could, at least, make mistakes less permanent. On the worst nights, when the old fear of public fury crept back, I opened the archive I'd kept. The printed bank transfers, the timestamps, the chat logs. I did not keep them to relish victory. I kept them as a manual of how harm was built, a reference for someone who might stand in the same blasted place someday. There's a strange courage in preservation, the knowledge that documentation makes patterns legible and shields others from the same fate. People still asked me, sometimes with sympathetic curiosity, whether I would have chosen differently. If I had known the collateral damage, friends' reputations dented, stories spun about my own motivations, would I have launched the campaign anyway? I think about the orchard I grew up on, the groves stripped for gleaming glass, and I imagine my father looking at the saplings we'd planted in the cleared soil and nodding slowly. He had been practical about justice. Fix what is broken, teach the next generation better tools. If revenge is a story people want to tell with fireworks and final acts, then perhaps it's less interesting than the truth. Repair is a long, boring, necessary work. I had wanted to tear down a lie with theatrical force, but instead I learned to use instruments of repair. Auditors, reports, counsel, and a stubborn community that favored truth over tidy narratives. There were moments of small, private satisfaction. The intern who'd once looked at me with suspicion emailed to say she'd gotten a job at a firm that valued transparency. The vendor who'd been coerced into early shipments wrote to say he'd been paid his backlog. These were not triumphant trophies. They were stitches. One late evening, I took my daughter to the park, a modest place of swings and a fountain. She ran ahead, shrieking with the uncomplicated joy that used to exist in my world before cameras and feeds and virality decided to rewrite our worth. I sat on a bench and watched people move in slow, ordinary lines. The noise of the world felt less sharp. I felt the kind of tired contentment you get after you've done something hard and necessary. I won't pretend the soundtrack of my life is wholly peaceful. Old habits return in small ways. The checking of mentions, the reflex to archive every conversation. But the reflexes are tempered now. They don't rule me. I had built a life out of quiet tools, and those tools were enough. The thing about being targeted is that you learn the anatomy of exposure. The thing about fighting exposure is that you learn the anatomy of repair. I found myself teaching those lessons not with grand speeches, but with patient, technical advice. Work that mattered rarely went viral. It mostly helped people keep their jobs, their reputations, their dignity. When the aftermath finally closed into a new routine, I realized something simple. Justice had a sound not of roaring crowds but of people getting on with their days. The man I'd been at the start of this, thin with worry and raw with anger, felt like a different person. Not because I'd broken someone, but because I'd helped rebuild a small corner of the world that matters. One evening I stood on my back porch and watched the streetlights come on, one by one. My daughter's laughter echoed faintly from across the yard. I thought of the video that had ruined me and of the files that had rebuilt me. The symmetry felt complete in a way I couldn't have planned. If I'd learned anything through the mess and the repair, it was this: the world doesn't need another spectacle. It needs, stubbornly, people who will do the tedious, honest work of putting things right. I closed the archive folder and locked the drawer. Outside, somewhere, a neighbor turned on a radio. The sound was ordinary and, at last, comforting.